Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 1. Down below main base, 9-2-52. The skies were clear for the morning, only a few fleecy puffs overhead and a line of them marshalling themselves across the northern horizon, beyond the river. It was a long view. It usually needed a day and a half for the horizon clouds to come down to Downbelow base, and they planned to take advantage of that break, patching the washout which had cut them off from Base 4 and all the further camps down the chain. It was, they hoped, the last of the storms of winter. The buds on the trees were swelling to bursting, and the grain sprouts, crowded by flood against the cross-beamed lattices in the fields, would soon want thinning and transplanting to their permanent beds. Main base would be the first to dry out, and then the bases downriver. The river was some bit lower today, so the report came in from the mill. Emilio saw the supply crawler off on its way down the muddy road downriver, and turned his back, walked the slow, well-trampled way toward higher ground in the domes sunk in the hills, domes which had gotten to be twice as numerous as before, not to mention those that had transferred down the road. Compressors thunked along out of rhythm, the unending pulse of humanity on down below. Pumps labored, adding to the thumping, belching out the water which had seeped into the domes despite their best efforts to waterproof the floors. More pumps working down by the mill dikes and over by the fields. They would not cease until the logs in the fields stood clear. Spring. Probably the air smelled delightful to a native. Humans had little impression of it, breathing in wet hisses and stops through the masks. Emilio found the sun pleasant on his back, enjoying that much of the day. Downers skipped about, carrying out their tasks with less address than exuberance, would rather make 10 scurrying trips with a handful than one uncomfortable laden passage to anywhere. They laughed, dropped what light loads they bore to play pranks on any excuse. He was frankly surprised that they were still at work with spring coming on so in earnest. The first clear night, they had kept all the camp awake with their chatter, their happy pointing at the starry heavens and talking to the stars. The first clear dawn, they had waved their arms to the rising sun and shouted and cheered for the coming light. But humans had gone about it with a brighter mood that day, too, with the first clear sign of winter's ending. Now, it was markedly warmer. The females had turned smugly alluring, and the males had turned giddy. There was a good deal of what might be downer singing from the thickets and the budding trees on the hills, trills and chatter and whistles soft and sultry. It was not as giddy as it would get when the trees sprang into full bloom. There would come a time that the Hisa would lose all interest in work, would set off on their wanderings, females first and solitary, and the males doggedly following to places where humans did not intrude. A good number of the third season females would spend the summer getting rounder and rounder, at least as round as the wiry Hisa became, to give birth in winter, snugged away in hillside tunnels, little mites all limbs and ruddy baby fur, who would be scampering about on their own in the next spring, what little humans saw of them. He passed the Hisa games, walked up the crushed rock pathway to the operations, the dome highest on the hill. His ears picked up a crunching on the rocks behind him, and he looked back to find Satin limping along in his wake, arms out for balance, bare feet on sharp stones, and her imp's face screwed up in pain from the path designed for human boots. He grinned at the imitation of his strides. She stood and grinned at him, unusually splendid in soft pelts and beads and a red rag of synthetic cloth. "Shuttle comes, Constantine man." It was so. There was a landing due on this clear day. He had promised her, despite good sense, despite axioms that world-synced pairs were unstable in the spring season, that she and her mate might work a term on station. If there was a downer who had staggered about under 2 heavy loads, it was Satin. She had tried desperately to impress him. "See, Constantine man, I work good." "Packed to go," he observed of her. She displayed the several small bags of no knowing what which she had hung about her person, patted them, and grinned delightedly.
I packed.
And then her face went sad, and she held out her open arms.
Come love you, Constantine man. You and your friend.
Wife. The Hisa had never figured out husband and wife. Come in, he bade her, touched by such a gesture. Her eyes lit with pleasure. Downers were discouraged even from the vicinity of the operations dome. It was very rare that one was invited inside. He walked down the wooden steps, wiped his boots on the matting, held the door for her, and waited for her to adjust her own breather from about her neck before he opened the inner seal. A few working humans looked up, stared, some frowning at the presence, went back to their jobs. A number of the techs had offices in the dome, divided off by low wicker screens. The area he shared with Miliko was farthest back, where the only solid wall in the great dome afforded him and Miliko private residential space. A 10-foot section with a woven mat floor, sleeping quarters, and office at once. He opened that door beside the lockers, and Satin followed him in, staring about her as if she could not absorb the half of what she saw. Not used to roofs, he thought, imagining how great a change it was going to be for a downer suddenly shipped to station. No winds, no sun, only steel about. Poor Satin.
Well,
Miliko exclaimed, looking up from the spread of charts on their bed.
love you.
Satin said, and came with absolute confidence, embraced Miliko, hugged her cheek to cheek around the obstacle of the breather.
You're going away?
Said Miliko.
Go to you home.
She said.
See Bennett home.
She hesitated, folded hands diffidently behind her, bobbed a little looking from one to the other of them.
Love, Bennett man. See he home. Fill up eyes he home. Make warm. Warm me eyes.
Sometimes downer talk made little sense. Sometimes meaning shot through the babble with astonishing clarity. Emilio gazed on her with somewhat of guilt, that for as long as they had dealt with downers, there was none of them who could manage more than a few of the chattering downer words. Bennett had been best at it. The Hisa loved gifts. He thought of one on the shelf by the bed, a shell he had found by the riverside. He got it and gave it to her, and her dark eyes shone. She flung her arms about him.
Love you,
she announced. Love you too, Satin, he told her, and he put his arms about her shoulders, walked her out through the outer offices to the lock, set her through. Beyond the plastic, she opened the outer door, took her mask off and grinned at him, waved her hand.
I go work,
she told him. The shuttle was due. A human worker would not have been working on the day he was leaving assignment. But Satin headed away with a slam of the flimsy door and anxious enthusiasm, as if at this late date someone's mind could be changed. Or perhaps it was unfair to attach to her any human motives. Perhaps it was joy or gratitude. Downers understood no wages. Gifts, they said. Bennett Jacint had understood them. The Downers tended that grave, laid shells there, perfect ones, skins, set up the strange knobby sculptures that meant something important to them. He turned, walked back through the operations center to his own quarters in Miliko. He took off his jacket, hung it on the peg, breather still about his neck, an ornament they all wore from the time clothing went on in the morning till it went off at night.
Got the weather report from station,
Miliko said.
We're going to catch it again in a day or so after the next one hits us. There's a big storm brewing out to sea.
He swore. So much for the hopes of spring. She made a place for him among the charts on the bed, and he sat down and looked at the damages she had red-penciled. Flood areas station was able to show them, down the long chains of beads which were the camps they had established along unpaved, hand-hacked roads. "Oh, it's going to get worse," Miliko said, showing him the topographical chart. "Comp projects enough rain with this one to get us flood in the blue zones again, right up to Base 2's doorstep, but most of the roadbed should be above the flood line." Emilio scowled, expelled a soft breath. "We'll hope." The road was the important thing. The fields would flood for weeks more without harm except to their schedules. Local grains thrived on the water, depended on it in the initial stages of their natural cycles. Lattices kept young plants from going downriver. It was human machinery and human tempers which suffered most. "Downers have the right idea," he said. "Give up during the winter rains, wander off when the trees bloom, make love, nest high, and wait for the grain to ripen." Miliko grinned, still marking her charts. He sighed, unregarded, pulled over the slab of plastic which served him as a writing desk, and started making out personnel assignments, rearranging priorities with the equipment. Perhaps, he thought, perhaps if he pleaded with the Downers, arranged some special gifts, they would hang on a little longer before their seasonal desertion. He regretted losing Satin and Bluetooth. The pair of them had been of enormous help, persuading their fellows in outright argument when it came to something their Constantine man wanted very badly. But that went both ways. Satin and Bluetooth wanted to go. They wanted something now in his power to give, and it was their time to have their way, before their spring came on them, and they passed all self-control. They were dispersing old hands and trainees and queue assignments down the road to each of the new bases, trying to keep proportions which would not leave staff vulnerable to riot, trying to make the queue folk into workers, against their belief that they were being used, tried to work with morale. It was the willing ones they moved out, and the surliest main base had to keep, in that one huge dome, many times enlarged and patched onto until dome was a misnomer. It spread irregularly over the next hill, a constant difficulty to them. Human workers occupied the several domes next, choice ones, comfortable ones. They were always reluctant to be transferred to more primitive conditions at the wells or the new camps, alone with the forest and the floods, and Q and strange Hisa. Communication was always the problem. They were linked by comm, but it was still lonely out there. Ideally, they wanted aircraft links, but the one flimsy aircraft they had built some years back had crashed on the landing field 2 years ago. Light aircraft and Downbelow's storms did not agree. Hacking a landing site for shuttles, that was on the schedule, at least for Base 3, but the cutting of trees had to be worked out with the Downers, and that was touchy. With the tech level they managed on-world, crawlers were still the most efficient way of getting about, patient and slow as the pace of life on Downbelow had always been, chugging away through mud and flood to the wonderment and delight of Downers. Petrol and grains, wood and winter vegetables, dried fish, an experiment in domesticating the knee-high pitsu, which Downers hunted. "You bad," Downers had declared in the matter. "Make they warm in your camp and you eat. No good, this thing." But Downers at Base 1 had become herders, and they had all learned to eat domestic meat. Lucas had ordered it, and this was one Lucas project that had worked well. Humans on Downbelow fared well enough, equipped and fed themselves, and stationed, even with the influx they had gotten. That was no small task. The manufactories up on station and manufactories here on Downbelow were working non-stop. Self-sufficiency, to duplicate every item they normally imported, to fill every quota not alone for themselves, but for the overburdened station, and to stockpile what they could. It was all falling into their laps here on Downbelow. The excess population, the burden of station-bred people, their own and refugees, who had never set foot on a world. They could no longer depend on the trade which had once woven Viking and Mariner, Esperance and Pan Paris, and Russells and Voyager, and others into a great circle of their own, supplying each other's needs. None of the other stations could have gone it alone. None had the living world it took, a living world and hands to manage it. There were plants on the board now. The first crews moved, to go for the on-world mining they had long delayed, duplicating materials already available in Pell system at large, just in case things got worse than anyone wanted to think. They would get massive new programs underway this summer, when Downers were receptive to approach again. Get it well moving in fall, when the Downers hit their working season, when cool winds made them think of winter again, and they seemed never to rest, working for humans and working to carry soft mosses into their tunnels in the wooded hills. Downbelow was due to change. Its human population had quadrupled. He mourned it. Milico did. They had gridded off areas already. Milico's ever-present charts, places which no human should ever touch, the beautiful places, the sites they knew for holy and the places vital to the cycles of Hisa and wild things alike. Ram it through council in their own generation, even this year, before the pressures mounted. Set up protections for the things which had to endure. The pressure was already with them. Scars were already on the land, the smoke of the mill, the stumps of trees, the ugly domes and fields imposed on the riverside and being hacked out all along the muddy roads. They had wanted to beautify it as they went, make gardens, camouflage roads and domes, and that chance was gone. They would not, he and Milico were resolved together, would not let more damage happen. They loved Downbelow, the best and the worst of it, the maddening Hisa and the violence of the storms. There was always the station for human refuge. Antiseptic corridors and soft furniture were always waiting. But Milico thrived here as he did. They made pleasant love at night with the rain pattering away on the plastic dome, with the compressors thumping away in the dark, and Downbelow's night creatures singing madly just outside. They enjoyed the changes the sky made hour by hour, and the sound of the wind in the grass in the forest about them, laughed at Downer pranks, and ruled the whole world, with power to solve everything but the weather. They missed home, missed family, and that different, wider world. But they talked otherwise. Had talked even of building a dome to themselves in their spare time, in years to come, when homes could be built here. A hope which had been closer a year or so ago, when the Downbelow establishment had been quiet and easy, before Mallory and the others had come, before Q. Now they simply figured how to survive at the level at which they were living, moved populations about under guard for fear of what the population might try to do, opened new bases at the most primitive level, ill-prepared, tried to care for the land and the Downers at once, and to pretend that nothing was amiss on station. He finished the assignments, walked out and handed them to the dispatcher, Ernst, who was also accountant and comp man. They all did a multitude of jobs. He walked back again into his bedroom office, surveyed Milico and her lapful of charts. "Want lunch?" he asked. He reckoned on going to the mill in the afternoon, hoped now for a quiet cup of coffee, and first access to the microwave, which was the dome's other luxury of rank. Time to sit and relax. "I'm nearly done," she said. A bell rang, 3 sharp pulses, disarranging the day. The shuttle was coming in early. He'd assumed it for the evening slot. He shook his head. "There's still time for lunch," he said. The shuttle was down before they were done. Everyone in operations had come to the same conclusion, and the dispatcher, Ernst, directed things between bites of sandwich. It was a hard day for everyone. Emilio swallowed the last bite, drank the last of his coffee, and gathered up his jacket. Milico was putting hers on. "Got us some more Q-types," Jim Ernst said from the dispatch desk, and a moment later, loudly enough to carry through all the dome. 200 of them! They've got them jammed in that freaking hold like dried fish. Shuttle, what are we supposed to do with them? The answer crackled back, garble and a few intelligible words. Emilio shook his head in exasperation and walked over to lean above Jim Ernst. Advise Q Dome they're going to have to accept some crowding until we can make some more transfers down the road. Most of Q is home at lunch, Ernst reminded him. As policy, they avoided announcement when all of Q was gathered. They were inclined to irrational hysteria. Do it, he told Ernst, and Ernst relayed the information. Emilio pulled the breather up and started out, Milico close behind him. The biggest shuttle had come down, disgorging the few items of supply they had requested from station. Most of the goods flowed in the other direction, canisters of Downbelow products waiting in the warehouse domes to be loaded and taken up to feed Pell. The first of the passengers came down the ramp as they reached the landing circle beyond the hill, crushed-looking folk in coveralls who had probably been frightened to death in transfer, jammed into a cargo hold in greater number than they should have been. Certainly in greater number than they needed on Downbelow all at one moment. There were a few more prosperous-looking volunteers, losers in the lottery process. They walked aside. The guards off the shuttle waited with rifles to herd the Q assignees into a group. There were old people with them, and a dozen young children at least. Families and fragments of families if it held to form. All such folk as did not survive well in station quarantine. Humanitarian transfer. People like this took up space and used a compressor, and by their classification could not be trusted near the lighter jobs, those tasks involving critical machinery. They had to be assigned manual labor, such of it as they could bear. And the children, at least there were none too young to work, or too young to understand about wearing the breathers, or how to change a breather cylinder in a hurry.
So many fragile ones,
Milico said.
What does your father think we are down here?
He shrugged.
Better than Q up above, I suppose. Easier. I hope those new compressors are in the load, and the plastic sheeting. Bet they're not,
Milico said dourly. There was a shrieking from over the hill toward base in the domes. Downer screeches. Not an uncommon thing. He looked over his shoulder and saw nothing, and paid it no mind. The disembarking refugees had stopped at the sound. Staff moved them on. The shrieking kept up. That was not normal. He turned, and Milico did.
Stay here,
he said.
And keep a hand on matters.
He started running up the path over the hill, dizzy at once with the breather's limitations. He crested the rise and the domes came into sight, and there was in front of huge Q-dome what had the look of a fight. A ring of downers enclosing a human disturbance. More and more Q-folk boiling out of the dome. He sucked air and ran all out, and one of the downers broke from the group below, came running with all-out haste. Saturn's Bluetooth. He knew the fellow by the color of him, which was uncommonly red-brown for an adult. Lucas, man! Bluetooth hissed, falling in by him as he ran, bobbing and dancing in his anxiety. Lucas man's all mad! That took no translation. He knew the game when he saw the guards there. Bran, Hale, and crew, the field supervisors. There was a knot of shouting Q-folk, and the guards had guns leveled. Hale and his men had gotten one youth away from the group, ripped his breather off so that he was choking, would stop breathing if it kept up. They held the fainting boy among them as hostage, a gun on him, holding rifles on the others, and the Q-folk and the downers on the edges were screaming.
Stop that!
Emilio shouted.
Break it up!
No one regarded him, and he waded in alone, Bluetooth hanging back from him. He pushed men with rifles, and had to push more than once, realizing all at once that he had no gun, that he was barehanded and alone, and that there were no witnesses but downers and Q. They gave ground. He snatched the boy from those who held him, and the boy collapsed to the ground. He knelt down, feeling his own back naked, picked up the breather that lay there and got it over the boy's face, pressed it there. Some of the Q folk tried to close in, and one of Hale's men fired at their feet.
No more of that!
Emilio shouted. He stood up, shaking in every muscle, staring at the several score Q workers outside, at others still jammed by their own numbers within the dome, at 10 armed men who had rifles leveled. He was shaking in every muscle, thinking of Riot, of Miliko just over the hill, of them close in on him.
Back up!
He yelled at Q.
Ease off!
And rounded on Bran Hale, young, sullen, and insolent.
What happened here? Tried to escape,
Hale said.
Mask fell off in the fight. Tried to get a gun. That's a lie!
The Q folk shouted in a babble of variants and tried to drown Hale's voice.
Truth,
Hale said.
They don't want more refugees in their dome. A fight started and this troublemaker tried to bolt. We caught him.
There was a chorus of protest from the Q folk. A woman in the fore was crying. Emilio looked about him, having difficulty with his own breathing. At his feet, the boy had seemed to come to, writhing and coughing. The downers clustered together, dark eyes solemn.
Bluetooth,
he said.
What happened?
Bluetooth's eyes shifted to Bran Hale's man. No more than that.
Me I see,
said another voice. Satin strode through, braced herself with several bobs of distress. Her voice was high-pitched, brittle.
Hale pushed he friend, hard with guns. Bad push she.
There were shouts from Hale's side, derision, shouts from the Q side. He yelled for quiet. It was not a lie. He knew Downers, and he knew Hale. It was not a lie.
They took his breather?
Take,
Satin said, and clamped her mouth firmly shut. Her eyes showed fear.
All right.
Emilio sucked in a deep breath, looked directly at Bran Hale's hard face.
We better continue this discussion in my office. We'll talk right here,
Hale said. He had his crowd about him, his advantage. Emilio matched him stare for stare. It was all he could do, with no weapons and no force to back him.
Downer's word,
Hale said,
isn't testimony. You don't insult me on any Downer's word, Mr. Constantine. No, sir.
He could walk away, back down. Surely operations and the regular workers could see what was going on. Maybe they had looked out from their domes and preferred not to see. Accidents could happen in this place, even to a Constantine. For a long time, the authority on Downbelow had been John Lucas and his hand-picked men. He could walk away, maybe reach operations, call help for himself from the shuttle, if Hale let him. And it would be told for the rest of his life how Emilio Constantine handled threats.
You pack,
he said softly.
And you be on that shuttle when it leaves. All of you. On a Downer bitch's word?
Hale lost his dignity, chose to shout. He could afford to. Some of the rifles had turned his way.
Get out,
Emilio said.
On my word. Be on that shuttle. Your tour here is over.
He saw Hale's tension, the shift of eyes. Someone did move. A rifle went off, sizzled into the mud. One of the Q men had struck it down. There was a second when it looked like Riot.
Out!
Emilio repeated. Suddenly, the balance of power was shifted. Young workers went to the fore of Q and their own gang boss, Way. Hale shifted eyes left and right, remeasured things, finally gave a curt nod to his companions. They moved out. Emilio stood watching them in their swaggering retreat to the common barracks, even yet not believing that trouble was over. Beside him, Bluetooth let out a long hiss, and Satin made a spitting sound. His own muscles were quivering with the fight that had not happened. He heard a sough of air, the dome sagging as the rest of Q surged out. All looked at them, alone with them. All 300 of them, breaching their lock wide open. He looked at them, alone with them.
You take those new transfers into your dome, and you take them in without bickering and without argument. We'll make new diggings. You will, and they will. Quick as possible. You want them to sleep in the open? Don't you give me any nonsense about it. Yes, sir.
Wei answered after a moment. The woman who had been crying edged forward. Emilio stepped back and she bent down to help the stricken boy, who was struggling to sit up. Mother, he reckoned. Others came and helped the boy up. There was a good deal of commotion about it. Emilio grasped the youth's arm.
Want you in for a medical,
he said.
2 of you take him over to operations.
They hesitated. Guards were supposed to escort them. There were no guards, he realized in that instant. He had just ordered all the security forces in main base off-world.
Go on inside,
he said to the rest.
Get that dome normalized. I'll talk to you about it later.
And while he had their attention,
look around you. There's all of a world here, blast you all. Give us help. Talk to me if there's some complaint. I'll get you access. We're all crowded here. All of us. Come look at my quarters if you think otherwise. I'll give some of you the tour if you don't believe me. We live like this because we're building. Help us build, and it can be good for you here. For all of us.
Frightened eyes stared at him. No belief. They had come in on overcrowded, dying ships, had been moved in queue on station, lived here, in mud and close quarters, moved about under guns. He let go his breath and his anger.
Go on,
he said.
Break it up. Get about your business. Make room for those people.
They moved, the boy and a couple of the young men toward operations, the rest back into their dome. The flimsy doors closed in sequence this time, locking them through, group after group, until all were gone, and the deflated dome crest began to lose some of its wrinkles as the compressor thumped away. There was a soft chattering, a bobbing of bodies. The Downers were still with him. He put out his hand and touched Bluetooth. The Downer touched his hand in turn, a calloused brush of flesh, bobbed several times in the residue of excitement. At his other side stood Satin, arms clenched about her, her dark eyes darker still and wide. All about him, Downers with that same disturbed look. Human quarrel, violence, alien to them. Downers would strike in a moment's anger, but only to sting. He had never seen them quarrel in groups, and never seen weapons. Their knives were only tools and hunting implements. They killed only game. What did they think, he wondered? What did they imagine at such a sight? Humans turning guns on each other.
We go up above,
Satin said.
Yes,
He agreed.
you still go. It was good, Satin, Bluetooth. All of you. It was good you came to tell me.
There was a general bobbing, expressions of relief among all the Hisa, as if they had not been sure. The thought occurred to him that he had ordered Hale and his men off on that same shuttle. That human spite might still make things uncomfortable.
I'll talk to the man in charge of the ship,
He told them.
You and Hale will be in different parts of the ship. No trouble for you. I promise.
Good, good, good.
Satin breathed and hugged him. He stroked her shoulder, turned and received an embrace from Bluetooth as well, patted his rougher pelt. He left them and started toward the crest of the hill, on the track to the landing site and stopped at the sight of several figures standing there. Miliko. 2 others. All had rifles. He felt a sudden surge of relief to think that he had someone at his back after all. He waved his hand that it was all right, hastened toward them. Miliko came quickest, and he hugged her. Miliko's 2 companions caught up, 2 guards off the shuttle.
I'm sending some personnel up with you,
He said to them.
discharged, and I'm filing charges. I don't want them armed. I'm also sending up some downers, and I don't want the 2 groups near each other. Not at any time. Yes, sir.
The 2 guards were blank of comment, objected to nothing.
You can go back,
He said.
Start moving the assignees this way. It's all right.
They went about their orders. Miliko kept the rifle she had borrowed of someone, stood against his side, her arm tight about him, his about hers.
Hale's lot.
He said.
I'm packing them all off. That leaves us no guards. Q wasn't the trouble. I'm calling station about this one.
His stomach tightened, reaction beginning to settle on him.
I guess they saw you on the ridge. Maybe they changed their minds. Station's got a crisis alert. I thought sure it was Q. Shuttle called Station Central. Better get to operations then and cancel it.
He drew her about. They walked down the slope in the direction of the dome. His knees were water.
I wasn't up there.
She said.
Where? On the ridge. By the time we arrived up there, they were just downers and Q.
He swore, marveling then that he had won that bluff.
We're well rid of Bran Hale,
He said. They reached the trough among the hills, walked the bridge over the water hoses and up again, across to operations. Inside, the boy was submitting to the medic's attention, and a pair of techs were standing armed with pistols, keeping a nervous watch on the Q folk who had brought him in. Emilio motioned a negative to them. They cautiously put them away, looked unhappy with the whole situation. Carefully neutral, Emilio thought. They would have gone with any winner of the quarrel out there. No help to him. He was not angry for it, only disappointed. You all right, sir? Jim Ernst asked. He nodded, stood watching, with Miliko beside him. Call station, he said after a moment. Report, it's settled.